Before we go to the reception room of the orphanage and look at the graffiti-covered portrait of Mr. Hoffman that is there, let's look at Jennifer's comment at the ladder on the staircase. That day when Thomas couldn't get down from the tree, the ladder, which had been collecting dust, sure came in handy. Back then, Mr. Hoffman was a kind and admirable teacher. I think that the words "back then" imply that Mr. Hoffman ceased at some point to be a kind and admirable teacher, at least in Jennifer's opinion. But Jennifer never tells us in the Once Upon a Time chapter, or anywhere else for that matter, what it was that changed her opinion of Mr. Hoffman. One would imagine that Thomas thought highly of Mr. Hoffman after being rescued by him. But as we will see, it appears that Thomas came to change his opinion of Mr. Hoffman as well. Here we see a graffiti-covered portrait of Mr. Hoffman in the reception room. This is a picture of Mr. Hoffman when he was a young man. He was so proud when he showed it to us. He never caught the one who doodled on it, though. But I know who did it. I saw Thomas trying to move the ladder on the day it happened. Jennifer uses the term "doodled on" to describe what's happened to the portrait. But whether this is a poor translation from the Japanese, or whether Jennifer is being deceptive in her use of terms, I don't think "doodled on" is quite the right way to describe this. To me, doodling implies a casualness and a lack of intent. And I find it hard to believe that there is anything casual or lacking in intent with what we see here. Consider the location of this act of vandalism, the reception room. This is where prospective parents would be received, and where I would expect orphans would be on their very best behavior, hoping to win adoption. To put an act of vandalism into this room would hurt the chances of every one of the orphans. This is not something that I think would be done lightly or casually. Consider that Thomas had to bring a ladder here in order to do this to the portrait. And that ladder, I expect, would have reminded Thomas of the time that Mr. Hoffman used the ladder to rescue him. And yet Thomas still defaced this portrait of Mr. Hoffman, of which he was very proud. Let's take a look at what was drawn on the portrait. The curly mustache and bushy eyebrows seem to me like rather standard, generic forms of graffiti ridicule. The other elements of what was drawn on the portrait, however, don't look so standard to me. Consider the jaws coming up from below to engulf Mr. Hoffman. Do you see the V shape of the open jaws and the long, sharp teeth? Does this send a message that I hope stray dog will gobble you up, or you deserve to be gobbled up, or a threat that you are going to be gobbled up? And consider the two dark squiggly lines going up from either side of Mr. Hoffman's head towards the top corners of his portrait. This looks like rope to me, and so I wonder if, combined with the protruding tongue and the mostly closed eyes, whether we have here an image of garroting, of Mr. Hoffman being strangled to death. There are two doors by which Mr. Hoffman can leave his headmaster's room. Through one door, he enters the reception room and faces this portrait. Through the other door, Mr. Hoffman would encounter other drawings by Thomas. Could it be that all of these drawings are part of one message being sent by Thomas to Mr. Hoffman? We'll consider that as we look at the other drawings of Thomas in an upcoming video. Please let me know in the comments if you have other opinions or observations about this graffiti-covered portrait of Mr. Hoffman in the reception room.